Have you ever lived through a moment when all your effort, love, and sacrifice seemed to mean absolutely nothing? Imagine saving every penny, planning for months, pouring in energy, time, and even your dreams into something only to be discarded at the very last moment by a single text message. 5 dry words, typed on WhatsApp, were enough to turn a dream into a nightmare. That's how this story begins, with rejection. Not just any rejection, but the cruelest one. A mother can face the rejection of her own child. When I read that message at the airport, surrounded by hurried voices and rolling suitcases, it felt like the ground vanished beneath my feet. I wasn't just losing a flight or missing an event. I was losing my right to belong, to witness a moment that should have been mine too. My son's wedding. It's painful to admit, but standing in that line, ticket in hand, I realized his silence screamed louder than any explanation ever could. This isn't just a story about pain. It's about transformation. Because sometimes, it's at the very bottom of the well that we find the courage to rise. This is the story of a mother who was reduced to a 15,000 receipt and an unused plane ticket, but who chose to reinvent herself. This is not about revenge. It's about dignity. It's about looking rejection in the eye and saying, "This is not where I end." You're about to discover how a single text can become the spark of an unexpected rebirth. How a rejected veil can carry the weight of generations. And how a will can become more than paper. It can be the undeniable proof that silence cannot erase the worth of someone who knows her own value. As you read, you may recognize yourself in parts of this story, not necessarily in the same situation, but in that crushing sensation of being invisible where you most deserve to be seen. Get ready, every chapter of this journey is more than just a tale, it's an invitation to reflect. Because this is a story about mothers and children, about money used as control, about choices that mark us forever. And above all, it's about something all of us need at some point: the chance to begin again. Before we go on, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, so you don't miss new stories and reflections that might just change the way you see life. Rejection, when it comes from the last place you'd expect, never announces itself. It doesn't knock, it doesn't give the heart time to prepare. In her case, it arrived in a short, almost careless message, written in lowercase letters, the way you'd cancel a magazine subscription. 5 words. Nothing more. But inside those 5 words, an entire world collapsed. And the silence that followed was even more brutal than the message itself. The heart reads and rereads, searching for hidden meanings, for explanations between the lines, but there are none. It's dry, blunt, like a blade that cuts without mercy. And this kind of rejection marks a life forever, when a mother's love, given so freely and so constantly, is treated as a burden. At the airport, surrounded by rushing voices and echoing footsteps, she held her phone as if it were a burning stone. Around her, life went on: families boarding, couples arguing about luggage, children laughing loudly, and yet she felt invisible. She had spent 15,000 to be there, not just in money, but in effort, in planning, in expectation. The ticket was bought, the dress set aside, the suitcase carefully packed. And suddenly, all of it seemed ridiculous in the face of 5 words. That's what rejection does: it turns plans into dust, memories into wounds, hope into cold iron pressing against your chest. Some might say, it's just a wedding, there will be other gatherings, other chances. But anyone who has lived through exclusion knows it's never just about the event. It's about what the event symbolizes. In that moment, the mother wasn't simply being uninvited to a party. She was being written out of the very story she had helped build, as if someone had said, "From here on out, we don't need you anymore." That is more than rejection, it's erasure from your own narrative. And when that exclusion comes with silence, with no explanations, the emptiness multiplies. There's a saying that life teaches best in moments of pain. Maybe that's true. Because there, among the spinning suitcases and the loudspeaker announcements, she learned a brutal truth: the love you give is not always the love you'll get in return. That unfair equation, one countless mothers know, can hollow out a soul. But it can also become the first step toward transformation. Because when you're denied a place at someone else's table, you realize it's time to build your own. And that decision takes courage. Rejection, cruel as it is, can also be a mirror. Looking at that message, she didn't just see her son's indifference. She saw the years of silent sacrifice, the unnoticed gestures, the unremembered sacrifices. That moment condensed decades of history into seconds. It was as if her heart whispered enough. You've watched too long, accepted too much, been silent for far too many years. Yes, rejection hurts, but it can also be the spark of something once thought impossible, a new beginning. Picture the scene: a crowded airport, rolling luggage, voices everywhere, and you standing still, staring at a message that reduces everything to nothing. Maybe you've lived something similar: an unexpected layoff, a denied invitation, a love ended by a cold phrase. Rejection wears many faces, but its impact is always the same: a hole in your stomach, a lump in your throat, a sense that life has veered off track. And that's where transformation begins. Because after the fall, the only choice left is to rise. It isn't easy. The first impulse is almost always to seek explanations, to replay every word, to call, to beg for a reason. But experience shows that sometimes, dignity is born in silence. Replying changes nothing. Grieving changes nothing. What truly changes is the decision not to be crushed. That's when rejection stops being a weight and starts becoming momentum. Standing alone in that airport, she took a deep breath. Her heart was bleeding, but she knew her future wouldn't be defined by that message. That cruel, blunt exclusion became the catalyst for everything that followed. Because if she hadn't received it, she might have gone on living on autopilot, accepting crumbs, confusing silence for respect. But there, in the rawness of rejection, the seed of something new was planted. And that's how pain becomes possibility. Rejection can be a sentence. But it can also be an invitation to reclaim your dignity and, for the first time in years, to write a new story. Among the things in her suitcase, there was one item that weighed more than all the others, even though it fit inside a small fabric pouch. It was the family veil. It wasn't made of expensive lace, nor was it adorned with precious stones. But it carried something no amount of money could buy: memory. Every stitch represented generations of women who had worn it on their wedding days. Her grandmother, her mother, her aunt, and now, it was expected, her daughter-in-law. Holding that veil was like holding not just fabric, but the living inheritance of a lineage. And yet, ironically, that object meant to unite had become the most painful symbol of rejection. Because along with the cancellation message came the unspoken command: the veil was no longer needed. It had been replaced, discarded, as if the entire history it carried were irrelevant in the rush to erase traditions. She unpacked it in the hotel room, where silence mingled with the hum of the air conditioner. She spread the veil across the bed and ran her fingers over the old stitches, some frayed with time. She remembered her grandmother telling stories of how this simple cloth had been washed and ironed with such care before each ceremony. She recalled her mother saying it was more than an accessory, it was a bond, a reminder that even in new beginnings, roots could not be ignored. Now alone, far from the celebration she had been cut out of, she asked herself, what does it mean to hold on to an inheritance your own descendants no longer want? The veil, once a promise, now lay before her as silence made tangible. And yet, objects heavy with history can also become teachers. As she looked at the veil, she realized her son's rejection was not just about denying her presence at the wedding, it was also about rejecting the continuation of something passed down for generations. It was as if he had severed not only his bond with her, but also with the memory of the family itself. That pain cut deeper because it wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who came before, suddenly made invisible in favor of a new narrative. The burden of exclusion stopped being just personal and became collective. It was as though she had been left with the mission of safeguarding alone a story that had always belonged to many. Objects hold that strange power, they provoke reflections where words cannot reach. As her fingers traced the fabric, she remembered the women who had worn it. Some endured unhappy marriages, others lived true love stories. But all of them carried within themselves the courage to keep going, even when life was not generous. Maybe that was the hidden lesson: the veil was never just a piece of wedding attire, but a quiet reminder of resilience. And in that moment, she began to see that a rejected tradition could become fuel for something new. Her son might have dismissed the symbol, but that did not erase the value it still held for her. We all keep objects like that. Maybe it's a book with notes in the margins, an old wedding band, a faded photograph. Their worth doesn't come from material value, but from the stories they hold. And it's exactly that which gives us strength in moments of rejection. When everything around us denies our place, those objects remind us that our identity doesn't depend on someone else's validation. On that hotel bed, the veil became exactly that for her, a reminder that even if rejected, she was still the keeper of an inheritance. That her son's silence wasn't powerful enough to erase centuries of dignity sewn into that fabric. That object, once meant to adorn a celebration, had taken on a new role. It had become a mirror. It reflected not only the exclusion but also the choice she now had to make. What do you do with a symbol that's been rejected? Keep it? Destroy it? Give it away? Every option carried weight, and she knew that whatever she decided would mark a turning point in her transformation. The veil could no longer be just a piece of cloth tucked away at the bottom of a suitcase. It had to be redefined, just as she now had to redefine her own life. And so, between memories and questions, she began to understand that symbolic objects don't exist to trap us but to remind us. The veil told her that the pain was real, yes, but also that there was strength stored up in her history. Her son could reject tradition, but he had no power to strip away her right to honor it. From that moment on, the veil stopped being a burden and became a promise, the promise that silence would never erase her voice. Deep down, it's like this for all of us. We all carry some kind of veil, something that represents where we come from and who we are. And when we face rejection, those symbols can be our greatest source of support. They remind us that we don't begin from nothing, that we have roots, that dignity existed before us and will continue after. And it's from that memory that the possibility of starting over is born. Because starting over doesn't mean forgetting, it means transforming. And that realization began to take root in her heart, sparked by nothing more than a simple piece of cloth that carried more history than any wedding ever could. Alone in the hotel room, the suitcase still propped against the wall, the silence felt bigger than the space itself. There were no family laughs, no animated conversations about the bride's dress, no hurried footsteps typical of a grand event. Instead, there was unfamiliar territory, a strange city, an impersonal room, and a woman who, for the first time in many years, no longer knew what her next step should be. It was as if she had been thrown onto a stage without a script, forced to improvise before an invisible audience. And that improvisation hurt, because it meant facing life stripped of the only role that had always defined her, being a mother. Now it was just her, and that felt like an endless emptiness. Walking the streets near the hotel was a strange experience. Storefronts glowed, couples embraced in cafes, families posed for pictures in front of monuments. The contrast was cruel. While the world seemed to move forward in harmony, she felt misplaced, like an extra wandering in a movie she didn't understand. She couldn't recognize the territory, nor the emotional language she was supposed to speak. The map she had always used, living for others, being the backbone of the family, existing for someone else's sake, had been torn to pieces. Now she stood without a compass. And yet, inside that discomfort, a possibility was beginning to stir, the possibility of drawing a new map for herself. The hotel itself mirrored this sensation perfectly. Everything was neat, organized, but cold. The carpet was too soft, the air conditioner blew a constant artificial breeze, the smell of cleaning products clung to the curtains. It was a neutral space, no memories, no identity. And strangely, that emptiness felt almost like an invitation. If her house back home was full of reminders of her son and her family, this hotel room was a blank canvas. A place where she could listen to herself without distractions. Where the absence of warmth also meant the absence of chains. It was uncomfortable, yes, but maybe it was a beginning. Her first impulse, of course, was to buy a ticket home right away. To return to the familiar, to pretend nothing had happened. But something inside whispered that running wasn't the answer. That maybe she needed to endure the discomfort a little longer, if only to discover who she was when no one else's expectations surrounded her. Unfamiliar territory isn't just a physical place, it's also a state of mind. And only by walking through it can we discover strengths we never imagined we had. It's like moving to a foreign country without speaking the language. At first, everything is confusing. Street signs make no sense, people feel distant, even grocery shopping becomes a challenge. But little by little, your eyes start to adapt, your ears begin to recognize sounds, and the strange becomes familiar. That's exactly what she was living through, not in geography, but in her emotions. The language of rejection was new, but hidden within it was the chance to learn the language of autonomy. As she passed through the hotel lobby, watching tourists clutching maps, she realized she herself was a tourist in her own life. No guides, no pre-written plans. And oddly enough, that realization brought a thread of freedom. Because if she was lost, then she was also free to choose any direction. What had looked only like abandonment began to show itself as opportunity. Yes, it hurt to be in that unfamiliar territory, but the pain was also proof that she was alive, still capable of feeling, still capable of changing. That sense of strangeness also revealed a powerful truth: rejection had cut the ties that once bound her, but that also meant she could now walk unchained. The hotel room, once a prison, could be reimagined as refuge. The foreign streets, once threatening, could be invitations to explore. It all depended on how she chose to interpret the scene. And slowly, a choice began to form. Perhaps it was time to stop waiting for her son to grant her a place, and to start creating one for herself. Unfamiliar territory is always frightening, but it's also fertile ground. It's where new seeds are planted. And without even realizing it, there, among closed suitcases and hushed hotel corridors, she began to nurture the idea of starting over. She didn't yet know how or when, but one truth was clear: she had lost a wedding, but she had gained the chance to write a new life. And that exchange, however painful, was already the first step of her transformation. The silent hotel room became the witness of many memories that started surfacing. They weren't light memories, but a collection of small and large sacrifices she had made over the years, almost without noticing. Her son had no idea, maybe he never truly knew what each choice, each renunciation, each sleepless night had cost her. Inside her suitcase was an envelope, a neatly organized folder filled with bank transfer receipts, notes, and statements. Nearly $57,000 sent over the years, always with the same justification: he needs it more than I do. It wasn't just money. It was life energy converted into figures. It was dignity surrendered in installments. As her eyes scanned the papers, she wasn't seeing numbers, she was seeing pieces of her own history, fragmented. And it wasn't only financial. Each line in that folder carried an emotional memory. The winter coat she never bought because her son needed help with a down payment on a car. The dreamed-of trip she cancelled because they needed her to pay off debts. The birthday when she didn't even get a phone call because he was too busy. None of that appeared on a bank statement, but all of it was engraved in her soul. It was a history of constant giving, silent, unquestioned, never demanding recognition. Maybe that had been her mistake, believing that love alone would be enough to be remembered. As she flipped through those sheets, she realized how easy it had been to neglect her own life in the name of his. That pattern, so common among mothers, now tasted bitter. Because it wasn't only about money. It was about worth. Endless self-sacrifice had once seemed like a gesture of love. But over time, she saw it had also become a tool of control. Money gives power, and someone who always receives begins to believe they are entitled to it, that the source will never dry up. And in the process, the one who gives forgets herself completely. She was staring at the proof: she had become invisible to her own son precisely because she had given too much. It's strange how sacrifices made in silence often become invisible. The one who receives gets used to it. The one who gives runs dry. And one day, the weight of all those small renunciations becomes heavier than any amount of money in an account. That's what she felt in that hotel room. It wasn't just the pain of being uninvited, it was the realization that she had financed, both emotionally and financially, the life of someone who now discarded her as if she were expendable. It was as though every dollar sent had been another brick in the wall separating her from her son. The folder in front of her was more than paper. It was a cruel mirror of choices that had cost her too much. This realization brought a mix of anger and relief. Anger, because it hurt to see how she had allowed herself to be used. Relief, because at last she could see the pattern that had always been hidden beneath the excuse of love. It was like turning on the light in a room you had lived in for years. In the dark the furniture hadn't moved, but now that you saw it, you could no longer pretend it wasn't there. She saw with painful clarity how much of herself she had erased. And that clarity hurt, but it was necessary. Because only by acknowledging the depth of her sacrifices could she begin to rebuild her life. Thinking about how many other mothers live similar stories, she imagined women everywhere opening their own folders and finding receipts of invisibility. It didn't have to be money. It could be time given away, dreams postponed, opportunities refused. How many times had a mother given up on studying because she had to care for her children? How many had left jobs behind to sustain someone else's projects? These sacrifices rarely make it into biographies, but they shape entire destinies. And sitting there in that hotel room, she realized her story wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger pattern, a silent inheritance of women who give until almost nothing of themselves remains. Yet, seeing it all written and organized also lit a spark of power. Because if that folder represented a past of sacrifices, it could also become the marker of a new chapter. All it would take was the decision that no new pages would be filled in the same way again. The record was written, but the future was still unwritten. And that realization, though small, was already transformative. At that moment, money, which had once been the tool of control, began to show itself as a tool of liberation. She closed the folder slowly, almost like a ceremonial act. There were no tears, no despair. There was, instead, the firmness of someone finally looking at her own life without filters. The papers wouldn't be destroyed, not yet. They would remain as memory and as proof. But they were no longer a sentence. Her son might have cancelled the wedding for her, but he had no power to cancel the dignity that was beginning to be reborn. And in that fragile balance between pain and clarity, the decision that would change everything was born. It was time to break the cycle. The silence of the hotel, which had once felt crushing, now turned into a kind of internal stage, where voices from the past and present clashed. The folder of receipts was still there, the veil rested folded on the chair, and the phone lay on the table with that message still screaming inside her. In that scene of contrasts, clarity finally arrived. She could no longer live the same way. Rejection had ripped the veil of illusion, leaving only the raw truth. Her son didn't just need financial help, he had learned to use it as a weapon of control. And as long as she accepted, she would remain his prisoner. For the first time in years, she felt she could choose to break free. The decision didn't come like a thunderclap, but like a thin, sharp blade. She picked up her phone and opened the banking app. The scheduled transfers were there, waiting silently, ready to keep draining her dignity month after month. One click, then another, and each payment was cancelled. The screen flashed "Operation completed." Never had a digital phrase sounded so liberating. Each cancellation was like cutting another invisible chain that had bound her. For the first time, silence was on her side. But she didn't stop there. She walked to the suitcase, pulled out the folder again, and opened it. Among the papers was a copy of her will, carefully kept. Until that moment, everything had been set so her son would be the main heir. Looking at those pages, a wave of sadness and indignation washed over her. How could she have planned to leave everything to someone who saw her as nothing but a burden? That's when clarity turned into action. The will would be rewritten. Not as revenge, but as affirmation. She needed to put into writing what was already happening inside her. A new life was beginning, and in it, there would only be space for those who truly respected her. Rewriting the will became more than a legal act, it was a declaration of existence. Each line that she planned to change was not about property, money, or inheritance alone. It was about reclaiming her own voice. For years, She had thought of the will as an act of love, a way to make sure her son would be cared for even after she was gone. But now she saw it differently. Love had been twisted into entitlement. Her sacrifices had been transformed into obligations. The will, once a symbol of devotion, had become a symbol of her silence. And that silence was finally ending. She imagined herself sitting in the lawyer's office, pen in hand, with a clarity she hadn't felt in decades. It wouldn't be about cutting ties out of vengeance, it would be about honoring herself and the people who truly valued her. Maybe nieces, nephews, friends who had stood by her side without asking for anything in return. Or perhaps part of it could go to a cause that mattered, something that carried dignity forward, beyond the narrowness of her son's rejection. Whatever the decision, one thing was certain: the narrative was shifting. She was no longer the invisible benefactor funding someone else's control. She was the author of her own story. That thought filled her with a strange, powerful calm. It was as if every cancelled transfer, every stroke of the pen on that will, was stitching back pieces of her own skin. She realized that dignity doesn't come as a gift from anyone. It is claimed, taken back, reaffirmed. And this time, she wasn't asking permission. The veil still lay folded on the chair, its fabric holding the weight of generations. For a moment, she looked at it and smiled faintly. Her son might have rejected the tradition, but she hadn't. The veil would not be destroyed, nor hidden away. It would be preserved not for him, but for her. It would remain as testimony that roots matter, that memory cannot be erased by indifference. That veil, together with the rewritten will and the folder of receipts, now formed a trinity of transformation, past, present, and future, aligned in her hands. When morning sunlight filtered through the thin hotel curtains, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: a beginning. The world outside hadn't changed. Couples would still kiss in cafes, families would still laugh in parks, planes would still take off without her. But inside, she was no longer the same. Rejection had burned her, yes, but it had also purified. Like metal in fire, she had come out scarred yet stronger, stripped of illusions yet sharper in truth. She picked up her phone again. The old message was still there, those 5 brutal words that had shattered her. But this time, she didn't feel the same sting. Instead, she saw them for what they truly were: not a sentence, but a signal. A cruel one, yes, but one that forced her to wake up. Without those words, she might never have stopped. She might still be giving, draining herself dry, waiting for gratitude that would never come. Now, those 5 words no longer chained her. They had freed her. The airport scene replayed in her mind: the rushing voices, the rolling suitcases, the ticket in her hand. Back then, she had felt erased. But standing in the quiet hotel room now, she realized she had not been erased at all. She had been redirected. The story wasn't ending. It was beginning again, this time on her terms. And maybe that's the real lesson of rejection. It can cut, it can humiliate, it can bring us to our knees. But it can also strip away everything false, everything borrowed, until only what is real remains. For her, what remained was dignity. What remained was choice. What remained was the power to rise. Not as revenge, but as affirmation. It was necessary to write on paper what was already happening inside her. A new life was beginning, and in it, there would only be room for those who truly respected her. As she imagined walking into the notary office, a faint smile appeared. For the first time in a long while, she was thinking about a future that did not depend on anyone's approval. The decision to rewrite the will was, in truth, the greatest symbol of something even deeper: the decision to finally put herself first. No more financing rejection, no more rewarding silence, no more compensating indifference. From that moment on, everything she would leave as inheritance would reflect dignity, not submission. It is interesting how moments of clarity often arrive right after a fall into the abyss. What had seemed like an irreparable loss, being uninvited from the wedding, was transforming into an opportunity to look at her own life through new eyes. How many people spend years without realizing they can, with a simple gesture, change the course of everything? Cancel a transfer, rewrite a will, erase a name from a list. Small external actions that, in truth, are internal revolutions. And that was exactly what happened. Their transformation ceased to be just an idea and materialized into choices. At the same time, there was fear. She did not delude herself into thinking it would be easy. There would be demands, maybe confrontations, possibly attempts at manipulation. But clarity had given her something stronger than fear: firmness. The submissive mother was beginning to give way to the conscious woman. Her heart still ached, but it no longer trembled. Every step, even the smallest one, was supported by the certainty that there was no going back. A bridge had been burned, and it was precisely that which allowed the construction of a new path. Deep down, we all have those moments of clarity that demand action. Sometimes it is hanging up the phone and never answering again to a call that hurts us. Other times it is closing a door, canceling a contract, or simply saying enough. These are gestures that might seem small from the outside, but carry within them the strength of a revolution. For her, canceling transfers and rewriting the will were not just bureaucratic tasks, they were silent declarations of freedom. And so, in the same place where she had felt the cruelest pain, she began her new beginning. The clarity born from rejection had turned into concrete action, and that action drew a new line in the timeline of her life. The son's wedding, from which she had been excluded, would no longer be remembered as the end of a story but as the mark of a rebirth. Because that is what happens when dignity meets courage. What once felt like loss transforms into liberation. Amid so much silence and heavy decisions, a face appeared like a breath of air: Clara, her granddaughter. Unlike the son, who seemed to have turned his mother into a shadow, Clara saw light in her. She was still young, full of questions and dreams, but she possessed that rare sensitivity of someone who knows how to listen with her heart. The bond between them was not written in papers nor marked by financial demands. It was engraved in small gestures, in looks that said more than rehearsed phrases. Clara was the bridge between a past of rejection and the possibility of a different future, because with her there was room for dignity, respect, and true connection. The first message from her granddaughter came simple, but full of life: "Grandma, are you okay?" It wasn't a perfunctory question, it was real, worried, affectionate. And in that instant, the woman who had been cancelled by her own son felt something mend inside her chest. There were still people who saw her, who recognized her as someone important. That small gesture worked like an antidote to pain, reminding her that, even in the midst of rejection, there are bonds that cannot be broken. It was as if Clara held her hand in the dark and whispered, "You are not alone." The curious thing was that while she thought of all the money she had sent over the years, she realized Clara had never asked for anything. What she sought was not material help, but presence, stories, long conversations on the couch. That revealed a tremendous difference. While the son saw his mother as a resource to be exploited, the granddaughter saw her as a root to be honored. This realization brought not only relief, but hope. Because if one generation had been lost to selfishness, another could bloom in respect. And perhaps that was the true meaning of rewriting the will, ensuring the inheritance was not just made of goods, but of values. The conversations with Clara became a point of support. The granddaughter wanted to hear old stories, wanted to know from her grandmother what weddings were like long ago, what life was like before social media, what choices were made in tougher times. And it was in this sharing that the woman realized something even more powerful: her story was not over, she could still teach, she could still inspire. The cruel cancellation at the airport seemed smaller compared to the sparkle in her granddaughter's eyes. Because those who truly listen return to life the meaning that the silence of abandonment once tried to steal. Clara became, then, a bridge character. Not only between generations, but between pain and hope. Beside her, the weight of the past seemed more bearable, because there was a promise of a future. It was like walking across a fragile bridge over an abyss on one side, rejection on the other, the possibility of a restart. And each word exchanged with the granddaughter strengthened that crossing. There were no demands, no manipulation, only genuine connection. And this kind of relationship is rare, precious, capable of healing wounds that once seemed permanent. She began to imagine how she could invest more time in that relationship. Not with expensive gifts, not with bank transfers, but with real presence. A meal cooked together, a simple walk, an afternoon of confidences. Small things, but carrying the power to rebuild what the sun had tried to destroy, the sense of belonging. Because when someone looks at us with affection, the feeling of invisibility dissolves. Clara offered that effortlessly, and so she became a lighthouse in the middle of the storm. The most beautiful thing was that by strengthening that bond, the grandmother also strengthened herself. It was a cycle of reciprocity. The more she allowed herself to be with Clara, the more she realized she did not depend on her son's recognition to validate her existence. The love she received from her granddaughter was proof that she still had so much to give, that her dignity was not lost, only buried under years of sacrifice. Now, it was being rescued with delicacy, like dust being blown off a valuable object to reveal its original shine. Thus, Clara was not only a loving presence, but a reminder that there is always an alternative to abandonment. That even when one bond breaks, others can become even stronger. The granddaughter represented continuity, but also renewal. She represented the possibility of building a new dynamic based on respect, affection, and conscious choices. And it was through this bridge character that the protagonist began to understand that, despite all rejection, there were still paths of love to be walked. The day of the wedding arrived. She had no invitation, no reserved seat, not even the right to be mentioned, but still she felt she needed to be nearby. Not to beg for entry, not to ask for explanations, but to witness. After all, how could she erase the desire to observe, even from afar, something she had once dreamed of sharing? She dressed simply, slipped the folded veil into her purse like a silent talisman, and walked to the church. She did not enter, did not get too close. She sat on a bench across the street, from where she could see the doors opening and closing, the guests smiling, the flashes of cameras lighting the sidewalk. There, in anonymity, she faced the harshest confrontation: to see herself excluded from something she had helped to build. As the people arrived well-dressed, commenting on flowers, music, and ceremony details, she felt the contrast between the collective joy and the silence surrounding her. No one knew who that discreet lady on the bench was. No one imagined she was the groom's mother, the woman who had financed so many chapters of his life, the same woman who was now kept on the margins as if she were a stranger. That invisibility hurt more than any harsh word, because it was as if her very existence had been erased from the official narrative. And yet, staying there, even invisible, was also an act of courage. Because facing exclusion without fleeing is a silent form of resistance. Her heart raced when she saw her son step out of an elegant car. He smiled, waved at the guests, looked radiant in his role as protagonist. He did not glance to the side, did not notice the bench across the street. Or perhaps he had noticed, but preferred to pretend otherwise. That doubt, however, no longer mattered. What truly mattered was what she felt: a mix of pain, love, and liberation. Because even as she suffered seeing him so distant, she also understood with final clarity that there was no return to what they once were. That silence between them was not a pause, it was an ending. The bride appeared soon after, radiant, dressed in white, but not with the veil she held folded in her purse. That detail, so small to others, was enormous to her. To see the rejected symbol replaced was like watching the family tradition being erased before her eyes. And still, she did not cry. She simply observed, and in that observing discovered something unexpected: rejection no longer needed to be only a wound, it could also be liberation. Because in seeing that the veil was no longer necessary to them, she understood that its value and her own did not depend on that marriage. As the music began inside the church, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply. She didn't need to see every detail, didn't need to follow the vows. The mere act of being there from a distance was confrontation enough. It was as if she whispered to herself, I know what is happening, I know the place they try to deny me, and still, I will not erase myself. Remaining seated on that bench was more than witnessing, it was reclaiming her own existence. Even rejected, she was still present. Even silenced, she was still watching. That silent confrontation brought a powerful lesson: sometimes, we don't need to shout to affirm our dignity. Silence itself can be a form of strength. There, without making a scene, without interrupting any ceremony, she made the choice not to disappear. Because to disappear would be to give them the power to define her narrative. Being present, even from afar, was a way of saying you may exclude me, but you cannot erase me from history. As the afternoon wore on, she realized that each detail seen from outside hurt less than she had imagined. The worst had already passed, because the true confrontation was not with her son, nor with the bride, nor with the guests. The true confrontation was with herself, to accept that she was no longer part of that story, but that she still had the right to write her own. This understanding, painful and liberating at the same time, was what allowed her to rise from the bench with firm steps and walk away. She no longer needed to watch from afar. She had seen enough to understand that the exclusion was definitive and that it did not mean her end, but the beginning of something new. And so, with the veil still in her purse and her heart full of scars, she left behind not only the ceremony, but also the need to be accepted at any cost. The silent confrontation had fulfilled its role to show that dignity is not lost when someone rejects us, but only when we stop seeing ourselves. And she saw herself. And that, for the first time in a long time, was enough. Back at the hotel room, after witnessing from afar the wedding that should have included her, the silence became even heavier. But this time, instead of feeling crushed, she sought a way to ease the weight. She grabbed a simple notebook, blue cover, bought from a small-town shop, and opened to the first blank page. The smell of fresh paper brought a sensation of renewal, as if whispering, "Here is a space that belongs only to you." And it was there she began to write. It was not a letter meant to be sent, but a conversation with herself and the absent son. Each word flowed heavy with emotion, as if the pen could draw out from her heart what her mouth had never dared to speak. "James," she began, writing his name with care, as if each letter were an open wound. "You cancelled me with 5 words. 5 words that weighed heavier than 50 years of life by your side." And the letter went on, long, intense, detailing each memory, each sacrifice, each gesture of love ignored. There was no rage in the lines, there was dignity. It was an attempt to record for herself that she had not been invisible. Writing was proof that her voice existed, even if it never reached the eyes of the addressee. As the pages filled, tears fell and blurred some letters, but she did not stop. There was unexpected strength in transforming pain into words. Each sentence seemed to lift a weight off her shoulders. The letter did not need to be read by him to fulfill its purpose. The purpose was simple: to liberate. To free the throat from its knot, to free the heart from its pressure, to free the mind from the endless replay of that same airport scene. Writing was organizing chaos into order. And the more she wrote, the more she realized that this silent communication had another function: to reveal truths she might never have had the courage to say out loud. "I gave you more than I had. I gave my years, my dreams, my money, my health. And still, you treated me as if I were disposable." The strength of those words on the page echoed inside her like a silent scream. The scream she had never dared to let out, but which now found safe ground. The notebook became confidant, friend, witness. Curiously, as the writing went on, the initial anger gave way to clarity. She no longer needed to convince her son of her worth. She no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The letter, though addressed to him, was in truth written to herself. It was her way of saying, "I know who I am, I know what I've done, and I will no longer accept being reduced to silence." And that shift was transformative, because it freed her from the need for external validation. The paper already validated her, the act of writing was affirmation enough. By the end of that night, many pages were filled. Some full of long sentences, others with scattered words, but all loaded with truth. She closed the notebook, breathed deeply, and realized something unexpected. She felt lighter. The wedding had happened, the son had chosen rejection, but none of that prevented her voice from remaining alive. The unsent letter became a symbol of autonomy, because it showed that she did not need an audience to exist. Writing, listening to herself, was enough. So often, the letters we never send are the most important ones. They are the ones where we finally tell the truth without fear, because we know no one will interrupt, no one will argue back. It is in this intimate space that the possibility of healing is born. And that was exactly what happened there. She healed part of her pain not by being heard, but by daring to speak to herself. The notebook, closed and kept, became more valuable than any gift, because it contained the record of a woman who, after so much silence, finally dared to express herself. And so, with a lighter heart, she fell asleep that night without tears. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because she had found a channel to transform it. The next day would still bring challenges, but now there was an unexpected ally writing. Each blank page of the notebook was a promise that silence would no longer silence her. And that promise, even if never sent to anyone, was enough to sustain her on the path of transformation she was beginning to walk. The next morning, the hotel room seemed different. The same carpet, the same air conditioner, but there was something new, the certainty that she could not carry forever the weight of everything she had stored. She sat at the table and opened the folder of documents. Each paper there represented sleepless nights, clothes not bought, trips never taken. For years, she had called it love. Now, she called it prison. And so she decided to end it. One by one, the papers were torn. Not hastily, but solemnly. The sound of paper tearing was like a melody of liberation. It wasn't just money being destroyed, it was the story of a woman deciding to stop being invisible. The veil, on the contrary, was not destroyed. She held it in her hands, as if holding a lifetime. For a few minutes, she let memories pass, old weddings, yellowed photos, the laughter of women long gone. And then she folded it carefully. Kept, but redefined. It would no longer be a promise for others, but a memory of strength for herself. In the mirror, she faced her own marks and whispered softly, "You survived." And at that instant, the reflection returned, not the rejected woman, but the woman who chose to live. From then on, dignity began to return like someone coming home from a long journey. First in small details, walking to the cafe and sitting alone without shame, opening the notebook and writing her thoughts without fear of judgment, choosing an outfit simply because she liked it, not because someone would approve. Each gesture, even simple, was an affirmation. It was as if she said to the world, "I exist, and I don't need your permission to be." Silence also changed meaning. Before, the sun's silence crushed her. Now, the silence she chose for herself was peace. It was the space where she could breathe, think, and listen to herself. She discovered that dignity does not depend on external recognition. It depends only on looking at yourself in the mirror and respecting yourself. And every time she saw herself standing taller, firmer, more secure, she realized she was rebuilding not just her life, but her very identity. It was then that Clara, the granddaughter, became even more essential. The bond between them stopped being just bloodline and became true partnership. Clara did not want money, did not want immediate inheritance. She wanted stories, companionship, presence. She wanted to hear her grandmother talk about books, about the past, about dreams still unfulfilled. And each encounter between them was like laying bricks for a new house, built on foundations of affection and respect. The absence of her son, which once was an open wound, began to turn into a scar. It still hurt, but it no longer defined who she was. Life did not have to revolve around rejection. There were other bonds, other ways to belong. With Clara, she created new traditions: movie afternoons, walks at the book fair, laughter over family recipes. Small gestures, yet powerful. Because they showed that love is not debt, it is choice. And deep down, that was the most precious lesson of this new dynamic: those who want to stay, stay because they value, not because they demand. The day she rewrote the will was the high point of this journey. At the notary's office, with the pen in her hand, she felt she was signing not only a document but an entirely new life. The pages reflected the truth she now carried in her chest: she would no longer leave behind submission, but dignity. Clara appeared as the guardian of her memory, not merely a beneficiary. The son, absent, was left out not out of vengeance, but because he had renounced the right to stand beside her. It was silent justice, yet heavy with meaning. From that moment on, rejection ceased to be a painful memory and became the mark of a new beginning. The airport, the wedding, the cruel silence, all of it was now part of the story of how she was reborn. She walked tall, her eyes shining again, and no longer needed anyone to recognize her. She recognized herself. She understood that life, even after the harshest exclusions, could still bloom. And that the power to begin again does not come from outside, but from within. Now, she was the protagonist. No longer a supporting character in someone else's life, but the author of her own story. And that, more than justice, was victory. Stories like this do not end with a period. They turn into lessons that echo inside those who have the courage to hear them. The rejection that began with 5 cold words on a cell phone at the airport had transformed into a powerful call to begin again. And if there is something we can learn, it is that pain, no matter how cruel, can become the spark of freedom. It is not easy to look back and see how many sacrifices were made in silence, how many times dignity was traded for acceptance, how many doors closed without us even noticing. But it is in this painful inventory that clarity is born. The past cannot be changed, but the future can be rewritten. When she tore up the papers of the financial transfers, she did not just destroy bank records. She destroyed centuries of a silent belief that love means erasure. When she folded the veil and kept it for herself, she was not just saving an old piece of fabric. She was redefining an inheritance. She chose that her story would not be defined by rejection, but by resilience. And when she looked at herself in the mirror and said, "You survived," she was not speaking only to herself. She was speaking to all the women who, at some point, had felt erased, silenced, rejected within their own homes. The dignity she rediscovered was not born from a grand act, but from small daily gestures. Sitting alone at a cafe, writing in a notebook, walking tall down the street. Simple? Maybe. But it is in those details that the soul is rebuilt. Because true strength does not lie in great external victories, but in the silent firmness of those who decide never to abandon themselves again. That is the true miracle, rediscovering oneself amid the ashes. And the most beautiful part of this journey was realizing there is always a bond that can flourish. Clara, the granddaughter, was that link of light. By choosing to nurture that relationship, the protagonist proved that life does not end with the rejection of a child, however painful it may be. There are always new paths, new people, new loves. Relationships built on respect do not demand disproportionate sacrifice, they offer genuine presence. And that is the legacy that remains: never accept less than your dignity. When she rewrote the will, she sealed more than a legal decision. She sealed a pact with herself. She decided that her inheritance would not be submission, but autonomy, not silence, but the rediscovered voice. This act teaches us that all of us can and must choose who has the right to remain in our story. Not as revenge, but as justice. Because love does not mean accepting everything. Love also means setting limits, even with those closest to us. And here lies the reflection that remains: how many times have you also put your dignity second to please, to keep the peace, to avoid rejection? How many times has imposed silence been mistaken for patience, and erasure disguised as love? Life is generous in giving us the chance to begin again, but it also demands courage. Courage to say enough, to close cycles, to choose new paths. And that courage, like dignity, does not come from outside. It comes from within. If this story touched you in any way, I now invite you to take one step further. Subscribe to the channel, activate the notifications, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Because just as the protagonist discovered she was not alone when standing beside her granddaughter, you too can become a bridge of hope for someone who, right now, feels invisible. Your subscription is not just a click, it is a gesture of support that keeps stories like this alive and helps others rediscover their dignity. In the end, this is not merely the narrative of a mother rejected at an airport. It is the story of all those who were once reduced to silence but chose to transform pain into strength. It is the proof that rejection does not define us. What defines us is how we respond to it. And if there is one thing we must hold on to, It is this dignity is not negotiable.